Happy Friday. All right, well, we'll get going. This is indeed recorded. So we will kick off and folks can catch up later when they're able to join. So thanks everyone for joining today's Clean Transportation Standard Work Group technical webinar on biomass-based diesel. We have not met, I believe, met all of you. I'm Shannon Nykstrom, and I'm the Clean Transportation Standard Director with MnDOT and our Office of Sustainability and Public Health. I'm joined today by a number of colleagues from Agriculture, Commerce, Pollution Control Agency, and Transportation, as well as our work group consultants from WSB and ICF. If you are a member of the public joining today for the first time, thank you for joining. If you would like to learn more about the work group and the process underway, I would encourage you to take a look at our website for more information. And you can always email me with any questions you might have. Today's webinar is the second in a series of 4 webinars. Noel, if you don't mind going to the next slide. It's the second in a series of 4 webinars on core fuel types that will be part of the Minnesota Clean Fuel Standard. Yesterday we discussed ethanol. Next week, we will cover transportation electrification and other fuel types, such as jet fuel, renewable natural gas, refinery efficiency and improvements, off-road equipment, zero carbon intensity opportunities, and much more. We also may make time for anything else that came up during the first 3 webinars. Recording of Phil's lecture portion of today and a brief summary will be posted on the CTS webpage as soon as we're able. And we also have just confirmed a land use, water, and ecosystem services webinar for October 16th. More details on speakers and the agenda to be shared shortly. And finally, our next full hybrid work group meeting will be on October 24th, again held at WSB's offices in Golden Valley and also online. I think folks that are joining in person and our staff would agree that folks that are able to join in person just get a lot more from it. The discussion is just a little bit deeper than we can get online. So we would just encourage all of you to please consider attending in person. For our agenda today, Phil Sheehy, our technical consultant from ICF, will again do a deep dive. And again, today it's on biomass-based diesel. This portion will be recorded. And then we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A with work group members. And then possibly 5 minutes for open public comment if there are interested public members that request this. So if you are a public member and you intend to comment, please let us know in the chat so we can make sure to make time for this. And then I just wanted to share kind of an overview again of the work group technical analysis components led by ICF that are happening in tandem with the work group process led by WSB. These 2 processes are continuing to feed into one another, and today's webinar is evidence of this. This slide will be shared during our first, the slide was shared during our first meeting and will be posted again on the webpage if you'd like to review it again. But just the full kind of objectives and details are outlined there. And then for the Q&A, just a reminder, Phil will walk through his slides. You're welcome to ask clarifying questions in the chat, and Phil will take these at the end. But please refrain from making comments or recommendations about the standard itself. These are really best suited for the full work group meetings. So I appreciate your cooperation and understanding with that. So with that, thank you again for joining, and I'll pass over to Phil for his overview on biomass-based diesel.
Great. Thank you, Shannon. Thanks everybody for joining. The screen went to the last slide, Noel. Or it's on slide. There we go. Am I in? I don't think I have control, but that's okay. I don't see the option to advance the slides like I did last time, which is okay. Noel, if that gets sorted out, shoot me a note in the chat. Otherwise, I'll just give you a heads up. Thanks everybody for joining this morning. I know that there are a variety of things competing for your time. So we are recording this, so those who couldn't make it, but this is the second of our jump into some of the technical details associated with the Clean Transportation Standard. I introduced some of these issues at our working group meeting, but the idea here was to provide folks with a little bit more background information, largely because you'll see a variety of like reporting, and this just to help ground it and make sure you understand where we're coming from. ICF has Shannon made this, it was helped clarify this. We're a technical consultant here. The working group is driving the decision-making process. I'm just here to try to help familiarize folks with the modeling tools, so that you can ask the best questions possible, and I can provide you with as informed an answer as possible. So the first one we did was on ethanol. The second webinar, we're going to focus on biomass-based diesel, which is kind of like a catch-all term for biodiesel, renewable diesel, and then I talk a little bit about about renewable jet fuel, excuse me. So you're basically taking a oil feedstock, and that could be from a variety of sources, and then you're turning it into a fuel, and the product is slightly different, right? So biodiesel is a fatty acid methyl ester that's blended into diesel. Renewable diesel is made a couple of different ways, but generally speaking, you would assume it's like a hydrotreated biodiesel. So you can, and it's chemically equivalent to conventional diesel, so it has some advantages in that regard, not exclusively, but like it's more of a drop-in. But biodiesel is too. It just has some constraints on how much can be blended in the fuel supply. And then renewable jet fuel is a slightly different formulation. But a lot of the folks, if you read about any of the announcements related to renewable diesel, you'll find that some of them are talking about making renewable jet too. And I mentioned this in the in the ethanol presentation, but it's unclear at this point, it's not unclear. The working group needs to decide the framework for which, if jet fuel would be included in the regulation and how, things like that. It's not there are some unique considerations there that need to be accommodated just because of the way jet fuel is regulated. So big picture today, again, the working group is charged with responding to questions around reductions in 2030, 40, 50 relative to a 2018 baseline. So again, it's kind of mundane, but we do need to decide like what the 2018 baseline is, right? So just to be clear, like that's like the first part. And there are just a handful of decisions that need to be made there. And then we kind of jump into the, answering the second part. So the first part of that question is like achieving a CI reduction from a 2018 baseline. So you have to say, okay, what is the 2018 baseline? The second component of the question is, can you, like, are those targets appropriate? And like, where are the gaps? Can this be done? And so that kind of is like a forward-looking component, right? So we want to ask two questions. One is related to the carbon intensity of biomass-based diesel. And I apologize, this should say carbon intensity of biomass-based diesel, not biodiesel. I'm sorry. Should have caught that. And then we'll talk about how biomass-based diesel across each one of those fuels could reduce its carbon intensity. And then the second component is how much can get blended into the market given other market pressures, right? Like if there's electrification, increased natural gas vehicle penetration. There's a bunch of ways that could put downward pressure, or the upward opportunities for blending more biomass-based diesel into the market. So if I mix up these terms like I did there, the carbon intensity of biodiesel, there are vested interests in each one of these fuels. I have no ill will towards any one of these fuels, just to be clear. If I mix them up or if I lump them together, I recognize technically there are differences between these, everything like that. If I stumble on my words or I blend them together, it's just because there is so much overlap. I am not criticizing any particular fuel or anything like that. So, but again, I'm trying to cover three fuels here, but big picture wise, like I think that we lumped them together because there are enough similarities that, the conversation can focus on those, but I recognize there are on the ground and market-based differences between these. I appreciate those. I just think for the sake of simplicity and because of these webinars, the time allotted, we kind of lumped them together. So next slide, we'll jump into that 2018 baseline. 2018 baseline is actually kind of handy because I don't have to worry about renewable diesel or renewable jet really in Minnesota back in 2018, going in the Wayback Machine 5 years into the past, right? So I can only have to communicate or talk to you guys about what should be included in that 2018 baseline with respect to biodiesel blending in the state. There are two components of that. How much was blended into the fuel supply, and then what is the carbon intensity? Those aren't like how much was blended in is we can understand. Hold on a second. see that option. I can request control, is that request remote control? So the so the first one is the blend rate, right? So as of 2018, Minnesota hit these targets associated with the biodiesel content mandate. So in 2018, it started this schedule here at the bottom, 5%. So it's a based on seasonal issues associated with, because of like cold weather properties of biodiesel. Typically speaking, that's what's driving the conversation there. And there are these, so these are minimums, right? Just to be clear, these values are minimums. So like it's conceivable that from April 1 to April 14th, you could blend biodiesel at 20%, right? Just to be clear, but you can't go, you're not supposed to go below 10%. And same thing, October 1 to March 31, there are with maybe some issues doing so because of cold weather properties there. But this is like what the requirement is. Again, these are minimum. You can request waivers. In 2018, there were a bunch of waivers, and most of them were like for a one-day issue associated with supply constraint and in the market. So there are a couple options here, right? One is you just say, all right, if you do the math and just say the market achieved a minimum of these buckets, Minnesota had a 12.1% on average weighted at biodiesel blend rate in 2018. That's probably the simplest. The other option you could do, just to be clear, I'm not advocating for either of these. The other option you could do, again, because you're comparing the carbon intensity in 2018, again, like the governor's task or charge for the workshop is related to achieving a % reduction from a 2018. And so that is from a number. So let's just say that number is 100 grams per megajoule. Can you achieve a 25% target by 2030? Well, you have to assign the carbon intensity for what is happening in 2018. That could be just from diesel, right? There's nothing that you could just say, okay, the baseline in 2018 is diesel, even though, but so then you could also say, well, we did have biodiesel in the market, so let's include biodiesel as well, right? So that should be the standard against which you measure. There are merits to both arguments. Oregon went through this, California did not, just by way of background. California had very, very little biodiesel blending prior to the low carbon fuel standard, so it wasn't a significant concern. Oregon already had a 5% blend requirement that is similar to, it's a little bit less, it's not as nuanced as Minnesota's. So they had a conversation with whether or not they were going to include that 5% biodiesel in the baseline. And we can do it both ways, right? I'm not the one who's going to make that choice. I'm just telling you that has an impact if you include biodiesel at a 12.1% blend rate, regardless of where that biodiesel came from. It's a lower carbon intensity than conventional diesel from oil. And that would mean that you have to achieve a lower CI target. Like the % reduction doesn't change, but the target would be lower, right? Because you would have a lower starting point. In Oregon, they ended up going with a 5% blend. They assumed, hey, we had required 5%, so the baseline should include 5%. But again, there was a discussion around that. There are merits to both arguments. I'm not advocating for one or the other, but that's something that the working group needs to decide. That's the first component, is the blend rate associated with biodiesel into the transportation fuel supply in 2018. It's either, generally speaking, you would say it's either 0 or 12.1%. And 12.1% might be a little bit high because of those waivers I mentioned. We don't have the data to go back and say explicitly like, oh, it was actually 11.9% in 2018. I couldn't find it. If there is data, then somebody should let me know. But again, there were those waivers issued, and they were basically like, there was, biodiesel wasn't blended for a handful of days here and there throughout that 2018 year. So the 12.1% would be slightly high, just by way of background, just slightly high. See if I can control this. Oh, I did it. Excellent. So I can control it now. All right. The second component is carbon intensity, right? So the baseline says, Steve asked a question. I saw that pop up. We'll get to that. I'll get to that at the end. I'll take that question at the end. That is a great question, Steve. Thank you. The carbon intensity component is, okay, how do we incorporate it into the baseline? So the carbon intensity of biodiesel is quite straightforward. It's somewhere between 20 and 35 grams per megajoule. There are numbers lower than that. There are numbers slightly higher than that. But in general, you're in that range. And that has to do with the feedstock you're processing, like what type of pretreatment is required for the feedstock, what the what the electricity grid intensity is. Like if you aren't using on-site renewables, then you're beholden to the carbon intensity of the grid, and that is of the area in which you operate, and that's done at like the system operator level, right? So like the MISO level, determine like in the California GREET model, right? So even in the GREET model, it's this regional function that you can't really get away from unless you can demonstrate you're using renewables, which I'll talk about. So again, that's the range. And then, so the other challenge is there are two components for that 2018 baseline. One is the feedstock mix used in 2018, and then the land use change adder, right? So that 20 to 35 grams per megajoule is just excluding the land use change discussion, which is complicated and warranted and important, but that 20 to 35 grams starts you off in the right place. There are a couple of ways you can go with that 2018 baseline level. Like you could assume that, hey, most of it's likely soybean oil based, right? Most of the biodiesel used in 2018 in the Minnesota market was likely soybean oil based biodiesel between the soybean growers facility, and then there were imports of biodiesel. I would guess, I don't know this for a fact, that the REG facility in Minnesota likely exported its product because it had an attractive CI where it could go to another market. I'm not 100% sure of that. I'm just saying. So I think you could spend time either saying this is what the feedstock mix was in 2018, which I don't think that there's reliable data on that. That's just my opinion based on what I've looked through. Or you could say it's based on, we'll just assume that it was all soybean oil, and that's the carbon intensity that we're going to use when we calculate that 2018 baseline, right? Now, the land use change adder, and I talked about this previously for ethanol, is something that is determined as part of the implementation of the regulation. California opted to, in 2015, did its own modeling using the GTAP model, and I've got a description of that on the next page. And again, the way that those models work, it's a CGE model, computable general equilibrium model, and you shock the system associated with a particular amount of feedstock that will be required to produce a certain amount of biofuel, and then there's a global reshuffling of land use. And then where there were any changes in land use, there are GHG emissions associated with that change in land use. And again, it's attributable, like through this modeling, to that shock. And then you aggregate those GHG emissions and you apply those emissions on a grams of CO2 basis per megajoule of fuel in the shock, right? So like you shocked the market by X, and that has a certain megajoules of fuel. So you can turn that into an adder on a greenhouse gas emissions basis. Now, California did that work in 2015, and the value for soybean oil is quite high. And this only applies to feedstocks that are purpose grown, right? So virgin oil feedstocks like soybean oil. Now, the Oregon adopted the California value for soybean oil. If you were at the previous webinar for ethanol, they did their own thing, but for ethanol, but they adopted California's value for soybean oil. Washington did the same thing. British Columbia has no land use change, right? So that's the opportunity associated with land use change, which is a separate discussion we're going to have. There are a variety of updated models, but again, I said this in the ethanol conversation, and I will say it here. I don't necessarily believe that new is always better. I'm not arguing that. I'm just telling you that there are different ways and different exercises that have been, or analyses that have been done to update land use change science. Generally speaking, those values associated with the land use change attributable to soybean oil that goes into biodiesel or renewable diesel generally speaking, those values are lower than what California uses. That's the trend right now, right? The more updated numbers tend to be lower, right? Based on a variety of factors. But I'm not, that's something that the working group needs to sort out in a separate conversation. I'm just communicating the facts on the ground. Okay. Just to be clear that a land use change adder does need to be considered, and it's an important part of the baseline and anything moving forward. Am I doing on time? Okay, I'm a little bit tight here. I think that was a little more verbose than I wanted to be. I want to get to the next slide. Oh, there we go. GTAP model is, again, a CGE model that's designed to do the shock, that agroecological zone emissions factor. That is just what determines the change in GHG emissions associated with the land conversion that results from the reshuffling of acreage. And then this model, like CARB, uses something else. Now, the CI trajectory of biomass-based diesel, again, those land use change models, we'll talk about those more in a separate working group, and that's why I'm not going to dwell on them, and I'm a little tight on time. So there are three types of change that we would consider for biomass-based diesel. There's the feedstock mix, and this is a little bit more relevant or a little bit more specific than, again, like just to contrast it with ethanol. Ethanol, generally speaking, we're looking at mainly corn. There are other feedstocks for ethanol, but like in this market, it's likely corn, and then there's some other opportunities, but it's not as critical as it is for biomass-based diesel. There are process improvements, and that's efficiency, deployment of renewable energy, et cetera. And then there is climate smart ag. Those are the three buckets that we would say, hey, if I'm looking forward, these are things that we could change in the GREET model to understand how biomass-based diesel, inclusive of biodiesel, renewable diesel, and potentially renewable jet fuel, would contribute towards achieving the target of 25% in 2030, and then the 2040 and 2050 benchmarks. I think it's 75% and 100%. I should know those by heart now, but I don't. It's okay. They're written down though. So, and just to be clear, everything moving forward in this part of the conversation is, I've tried to focus on the GHG emissions associated with producing these feedstocks. Excuse me, with producing biodiesel, renewable diesel, and renewable jet. I'm not talking about that land use change adder. The green bar is out of, like, and again, I very strategically did not apply a number to either the blue nor the green bar, because I'm just saying that when we're talking about the blue and the green bar, they're separate issues. So I'm trying to focus on the blue bar. There's maybe a little bit of mix. So we'll move forward from there. So from the trajectory standpoint, it takes a little bit for these slides to go. Do I need to click? Is that better? My computer. There we go. Feedstock mix. So I have to minimize something on my screen, excuse me, so that I can see this better. Okay, so in 2018, there's a document that the Minnesota Department of Agriculture that put forward that said, 45% of biodiesel in Minnesota is derived from soybean oil, and 55% is other fats, oils, and greases. So I think that's tied to production, not consumption, just to be clear. I don't know this for a fact, but I would guess that the lower carbon fats, oils, and greases, that 55% was exported out of Minnesota to achieve to get value out of California. I believe that. I'm not 100% sure of that, but it's conceivable that REG was doing that in 2018, maybe not, but it could have been produced in state. I'm not 100% sure, or produced in state and then used in state. But again, the feedstock mix has an impact, right? So I just put this graph together for illustrative purposes. The question that we're seeking to answer here is, to what extent can these fuels, biomass-based diesel, whether it be renewable diesel, renewable jet, or biodiesel, the extent to which they can contribute is largely tied to the extent that you apply a land use change adder to soybean and the carbon and the mix of feedstock, or the other mix of feedstock. So I put this graph together. This is renewable diesel in California. The volumes aren't that important. Like the volumes aren't as important. That's the left axis. These are volumes. This black line is carbon intensity, which ties to this graph on the right here, if you're looking at this graph, right? So it started around 30, right? I told you earlier in the slide, it's somewhere between 20 and 35, right? So this is 2017. I don't know all of the feedstocks because CARB didn't report it in 2017 for renewable diesel volumes that were delivered to California. It was very likely tallow, because in 2017, the main player in the game was Neste. So they were importing tallow-based renewable diesel, probably some other stuff, right? So then you can see there's a slight uptick here at the end, just slight, over time, it kind of ticked up. There's a couple of things that are driving that. One of those, in general, like these feedstocks don't have that different of a carbon intensity. This soy has a high penalty in California's market, the blue bar here, right? So this blue bar, you see it start to creep in. So California, up until the second quarter of 2021, the market was almost exclusively receiving non-virgin oil-based feedstocks for renewable diesel. And that's just because the value in the program is higher if you can use these lower carbon feedstocks. That's the price signal the market sent, so it responded. So you can see this, you start to see like some of these facilities coming online that can only use soybean oil. That's this blue bar. Then you can see that corresponds with a slight uptick in the carbon intensity, right? So really the contribution of biodiesel, renewable jet, apart from the alcohol to jet component, is gonna be made, it's gonna be driven by the feedstock that you assume in the mix. And then that is tied to, okay, if you're using soy, if the land use change adder for soybean is high, and I'm not arguing whether if it's high like California's, it will push up the carbon intensity of the average carbon intensity of the product in the market, right? But it will, if it's lower, it won't have as material of an impact, right? So this mix is important. The land use change for soy-based biodiesel is about 30 grams per megajoule. So the carbon intensity of renewable diesel from soybean oil in California is between 55 and 60 usually. So that's what's this soybean oil is pushing up on this, this roughly 30 to 35 grams per megajoule. It's starting to push it up a little bit higher. Okay. Now that's how am I doing on time? I'm a little tight here. I was better on ethanol. Okay. So I'll keep moving. So again, the feedstock mix and then what the land use change adder is, that's what's gonna, like what we assume for the land use change and the feedstock mix is pretty much what's going to determine the contribution of these fuels in the market. I'm going to the next slide. My slides are okay. Process efficiency improvements, minor improvements. You can see here, this is for biodiesel in California. We have a little bit of canola in California, so there is some land use change there, but there isn't that same discernible decrease in carbon intensity that you saw for ethanol. And part of that is just because it's a little bit harder to eke out some of these efficiency improvements, I believe, for biodiesel facilities. But there are some interesting step changes, right? If you're not using the grid CI, like a state-specific, I saw somebody ask the question, a state-specific grid mix, and you're not beholden to that, right? Which has like maybe, it's maybe a little bit higher carbon intensity than what you think you could achieve. What you can do is you can deploy renewable electricity at the facility. Luckily, the REG facility in Minnesota has done this work for me. They had a pathway for biodiesel that was trucked and rail card into California. They had a pathway in 2019, and then they recertified in 2022. And I don't know, I haven't looked through the application package in great detail, but based on my initial review, a big chunk of that is related to the renewable electricity. That, like, they went from using the grid to renewable electricity, right? That's because again, that's driving the carbon intensity of that fuel. So their corn oil-based biodiesel pathway, or distiller's corn oil, DCO, so they're using a byproduct of ethanol production. That's where the corn oil comes from. They're running it through their facility, and they dropped their carbon intensity by about 9 grams per megajoule. There's more that going on than just the renewable electricity, but that's a big part of it. And then the same thing with one of their tallow-based pathways. They dropped their carbon intensity by 7 grams per megajoule. So it's not that same gradual change, but if you send that price signal from these programs, you could see that the carbon intensity could decrease. So that's why I'm calling it process improvements. There's a bunch of things you could do to knock out carbon intensity points. It's a little less gradual than what you saw for ethanol, but again, you need like general uptake of that. So, and then the last one is related to climate smart agriculture. As soon as the slide catches up, you'll see, but slightly different here. ICF has started some work for USDA. This isn't published, but I did speak with USDA and we were allowed to share some of our initial findings. But in general, we created this long list of things that could be done to reduce the carbon intensity associated with the production of soybean oil, soybean farming in the same way that we did for corn, right? And so, but one of the big components of of soybean oil, excuse me, of corn that you can drop its carbon intensity associated with the nitrogen application, the fertilizer. And soybean oil is actually pretty, the soybean oil farmers are, excuse me, soybean farmers are pretty efficient with respect to fertilizer application, and they have a low fertilization rate. It sounds like I'm commenting on something else, a low fertilizer rate. So there isn't that same opportunity. So the carbon intensity reduction potential from, again, just that direct component is probably around 13.5%. And that would knock soybean oil down into soybean oil based product, whether it's biodiesel or renewable diesel. That would knock it down to be, again, without that land use change adder, it would knock it down and look a little bit more like a corn oil type product. So again, that ends up being about a 13% reduction if you implement all of that and track it. That's our assumption. I'm trying to get to that. I think I'm a little pressed for time. So this is my last slide. So I did okay. So the scenario modeling, we got to decide the feedstocks, right? The feedstock mix and the blend rate. Like I'm assuming that the market just continues along on its current blend. I don't know if I would be interested if the working group or others have data or something to demonstrate that the market could push above the blend requirements in certain instances for biodiesel. I would I think that the constraints on biodiesel associated with like cold weather performance and stuff, that it's likely, but I can't say for certain, that there might be more renewable diesel deployment. Generally speaking, when one of these a low carbon fuel standard or a clean fuels program or a clean transportation standard has come online, we start to see an influx of renewable diesel because it's an attractive compliance option. We saw that in California, and then it's now moving into Oregon. Small volumes in Washington, small volumes in Canada, reasonable volumes in British Columbia. So again, these were markets that did not get renewable diesel, and then they do. So that's just saying that, like, again, there's potential for increased blends of biodiesel, but it will be competing directly with renewable diesel. And then given the very the value of the SAF tax credit in Minnesota, if renewable jet is in play, we would assume that that tax credit is a considerable vacuum or a considerable like draw to SAF producers in Minnesota. So we would include that. We will include that in our modeling and the associated carbon intensity and stuff. It just we would need to know whether or not, again, there's an obligation on the conventional side, things like that. But again, it has what's driving any of our conversations here. I put the numbers up here, and again, REG's facility in Minnesota helps make my case because it's in California. You can see the differences in the carbon intensity, right? So they're a multi-feedstock capable facility. They can process all of these feedstocks and they can get these all to California. So they run a mix of corn oil, tallow, used cooking oil, soybean oil, and canola. And again, these penalties for soybean oil and canola are around 30 grams per megajoules. These include the California land use change adder, right? So I'm not saying that I'm just giving these are certified pathways in the LCFS. So you can see how the mix changes the compliance outlook. So that's all I got. Sorry, I'm done. I apologize. So that's it. So we can move on to questions.